Hi, I'm Emma. And 3 years ago, Jake Harrison looked me in the eyes at Riverside Gardens Chapel and told me I was too ugly to be his wife. In front of 200 guests, in my grandmother's vintage lace dress, with my bouquet of white roses trembling in my hands. But what he didn't know was that September 15th would become the day I stopped shrinking myself for anyone. And when he saw me walk into his new wedding exactly 3 years later, his face told me everything I needed to know about the woman I'd become. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Some stories begin with love. Mine begins with the sound of silence so thick you could cut it with a butter knife. Picture this. September 15th, 3 years ago, Austin's Riverside Gardens Chapel filled with the soft glow of afternoon sunlight streaming through stained glass windows. My hands were shaking as I held my grandmother's vintage camera, the one she'd carried on her own wedding day 60 years earlier. I wasn't the photographer that day, though. I was supposed to be the bride. The morning had started like every bride's dream. My sister Sofia was curling the last pieces of my hair in our hotel room, while my mother pressed the final wrinkles from my grandmother's dress. The lace felt like history against my skin, each delicate thread telling stories of love that lasted, promises that were kept, vows that meant something. I kept touching the pearl buttons running down the back, the same ones my grandmother had fastened with trembling fingers when she married my grandfather after he returned from Korea. I should have known something was wrong when Jake didn't answer my good morning text, or when his best man called 3 times asking if Jake was with me. But I was floating in that bubble brides live in, where everything feels magical and nothing can go wrong because this is your day, your moment, your happily ever after. The chapel was perfect. White roses cascaded from every surface, their petals scattered down the aisle like snow in September. The string quartet we'd hired was tuning their instruments, filling the space with those sweet, anticipatory notes that make your heart skip. Our families filled the wooden pews, all dressed in their finest, cameras ready to capture what was supposed to be the most beautiful day of my life. I remember standing in the bridal suite, looking at myself in the floor-length mirror one last time. The dress fit like it was made for me, cinched at the waist and flowing in layers of ivory silk and antique lace. My makeup artist had done something magical with contouring that made my cheekbones look sharp enough to cut glass, and my hair fell in soft waves over one shoulder. For the first time in my life, I felt genuinely beautiful. Not pretty, in a sweet way. Not cute like people always said, but actually, breathtakingly beautiful. Sophia handed me my bouquet, white roses mixed with eucalyptus and baby's breath, tied with a silk ribbon that matched my dress. The florist had tucked a small sprig of rosemary into the arrangement for remembrance, and the scent filled my nose as I took one last deep breath before walking to meet my future husband. The processional music began, and I felt my heart hammering against my ribs in the best possible way. This was it. After 2 years of dating and 8 months of planning, I was about to marry Jake Harrison, the man who made me laugh until my stomach hurt, who brought me coffee every morning during finals week when we were still in college, who proposed on the same hiking trail where we had our first real conversation about our future. My father took my arm at the back of the chapel, and I saw him wipe away a tear he thought I wouldn't notice. The doors opened, and every head turned toward me. I saw my college roommates in the 3rd row, Jake's co-workers from the real estate office, my grandmother's best friends who had traveled from San Antonio just to see me in her dress. The photographer was moving quietly along the side aisle, capturing every moment. But my eyes were fixed on the altar, where Jake stood in his charcoal gray suit, the one we'd picked out together at Nordstrom 3 months earlier. He looked handsome, his dark hair freshly cut, his shoulders straight. For a moment, everything felt exactly as it should. I took my first step down the aisle, then another, feeling the weight of my grandmother's dress swaying around my ankles. The string quartet played our song, the same one we'd danced to in his apartment kitchen on random Tuesday evenings when we were just being young and in love and couldn't imagine anything ever changing. But then I saw his face. Really saw it. Jake wasn't smiling. He wasn't crying happy tears like we'd joked he would. He was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between shock and disappointment, and something else I couldn't name. His jaw was tight, his eyes narrowed slightly, and his hands were clenched at his sides instead of relaxed and ready to take mine. I kept walking because what else do you do when 200 people are watching and the photographer is capturing every step and your father is gently guiding you forward with his hand on your arm? But with each step, Jake's expression grew more uncomfortable, more distant, like he was watching a stranger approach instead of the woman he'd promised to love forever. When I reached the altar, my father kissed my cheek and placed my hand in Jake's. His palm was cold and slightly damp, and he didn't squeeze my fingers the way he usually did. The pastor began speaking about love and commitment and the sacred bond of marriage, but I could feel something shifting in the air around us, something heavy and wrong. Jake was supposed to be looking into my eyes during the opening remarks, but he kept glancing over my shoulder at the congregation, then back at me with that same strange expression. I tried to catch his gaze, to give him a reassuring smile, to remind him that this was us, this was our moment. But he wouldn't hold eye contact for more than a second. The pastor asked if there was anyone who objected to this union, and I actually felt relieved when no one spoke up because at that point I was starting to worry that someone might. But then came the moment that changed everything. The pastor looked at Jake and began the traditional vows. Do you, Jake Harrison, take Emma Rodriguez to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part? The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Jake looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw something crumble in his expression. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then shook his head almost imperceptibly. I can't, he said, but so quietly that only the front row could hear him. The pastor leaned forward slightly. I'm sorry? Jake's voice was stronger this time, carrying across the chapel like a stone thrown through glass. I can't do this. The collective gasp from the congregation was audible. I felt my bouquet trembling in my hands, the white roses suddenly feeling heavy as stones. This had to be pre-wedding nerves, right? Cold feet that would pass in a moment? Jake, I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. What's wrong? We can take a minute if you need to. He cut me off, and when he spoke, his words landed like physical blows. Emma, I'm sorry, but I can't marry someone who looks like you. The chapel fell completely silent, except for the sound of my heart breaking so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. I stared at him, certain I'd misheard, certain he couldn't have just said what I thought he said. What? My voice came out as barely a whisper. Jake's face was flushed now, but not with embarrassment. With something that looked almost like anger, like I'd somehow forced him into this position. I've been trying to convince myself for months that it would be okay, that looks don't matter, that I love your personality enough to make up for. But standing here now, looking at you in that dress, thinking about our wedding photos, thinking about introducing you as my wife, he shook his head. I just can't pretend anymore. You're not beautiful enough to be my wife. The words hit me like a physical force. Someone in the congregation let out a small cry, and I heard my mother's sharp intake of breath from the front row. The photographer had stopped taking pictures and was staring at the scene unfolding in front of her with obvious shock. I looked down at myself in my grandmother's dress, the same dress I'd felt so beautiful in just minutes earlier. The same dress where every detail had been perfect. where every fold and button and piece of lace had made me feel like a princess stepping out of a fairy tale. Now it felt like a costume, like I was playing dress-up in clothes that belonged to someone else. "Jake, please," I managed to say, though my voice was shaking so badly I could barely get the words out. "You don't mean this. You're just nervous. We can—" "I do mean it," he said, and there was a finality in his tone that cut through any hope I might have been clinging to. "I'm sorry, Emma. I thought I could overlook it, but I can't. You deserve someone who thinks you're beautiful, and I'm not that person." The irony of his words wasn't lost on me even in that moment. He was rejecting me for not being beautiful enough while simultaneously claiming I deserved someone who thought I was beautiful. It was a cruelty wrapped in fake kindness, the worst kind of rejection. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, still holding my bouquet, still wearing my grandmother's dress, still believing somehow that this was a nightmare I would wake up from. But Jake was already stepping back from the altar, already turning away from me, already walking down the aisle he was supposed to walk down with me as his wife. The congregation erupted in shocked murmurs and whispered conversations. I could hear fragments of their voices. Did he really just... I can't believe... That poor girl. But their voices sounded like they were coming from underwater, muffled and distant and surreal. My father appeared at my side, his face pale with fury and shock. My mother was crying in the front row, not the happy tears she'd planned to shed, but tears of heartbreak and humiliation for her daughter. Sofia was already standing, ready to create a barrier between me and the gawking guests if I needed it. But I couldn't move. I stood at that altar, in my grandmother's dress, holding my bouquet of white roses, and felt something inside me break so completely that I wondered if it would ever heal. Not just my heart, though that was shattered too. Something deeper than that. My sense of worth, my understanding of myself, my belief that I was lovable just as I was. Jake had made it to the back of the chapel and was disappearing through the doors without a backward glance. His groomsmen followed him, looking embarrassed and confused, leaving me standing at an altar decorated for a wedding that would never happen. The pastor, bless him, was trying to figure out what to do. He'd probably never had a groom abandon a bride at the altar before, certainly not with such cruel honesty about his reasons. He approached me gently, his voice kind but uncertain. "Emma, dear, would you like to—" I finally found my voice, though it came out hoarse and broken. "Could everyone please leave?" The request was quiet, but in the stunned silence of the chapel, everyone heard it. My father squeezed my shoulder and began politely but firmly asking the guests to give us some privacy. The photographer packed up her equipment quickly, though I noticed she left her card on the table by the guest book. The string quartet gathered their instruments and slipped out through a side door. Within 10 minutes, the chapel was empty except for my immediate family. My mother, Sofia, my father, and me, standing in a space that had been decorated for celebration and now felt like a mausoleum for my dreams. I finally let go of the bouquet, and it fell to the floor with a soft thud, white petals scattering across the burgundy carpet. The sound seemed to break something loose inside me, and I started laughing. Not happy laughter, but the kind of laugh that comes when reality is so absurd that your brain can't process it any other way. "He said I wasn't beautiful enough," I said to my family, and hearing the words out loud made them somehow more real and more impossible at the same time. In front of everyone, in Grandma's dress, he said I wasn't beautiful enough to be his wife. Sofia was beside me in an instant, her arms around me, holding me up as my knees finally gave way. "Emma, he's an idiot. He's a cruel, shallow idiot. And you're better off without him." But her words, meant to comfort, only made the pain worse. Because the truth was, I had loved him. I had planned a life with him. I had spent 8 months picking out flowers and choosing a menu and addressing invitations for a future that he'd just destroyed in front of 200 people with a handful of brutal sentences. My mother was crying openly now, makeup running down, her cheeks. "Mija, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry this happened to you." My father was pacing behind us, his hands clenched into fists. "I should have seen this coming. I should have known he wasn't good enough for you. The way he looked at other women sometimes, the comments he made about your appearance, that stopped me cold." "What comments?" Dad's face fell as he realized he'd said too much. "Emma, it doesn't matter now." "What comments, Dad?" Sofia and my mother exchanged glances, and I knew from their expressions that they'd all noticed. Things I'd somehow missed or chosen to ignore. My father sat down heavily in one of the pews, suddenly looking older than his 55 years. "Little things," he said quietly. "Comments about your makeup, suggestions about your hair. The way he'd compare you to women on TV or his friends' girlfriends. We hoped it was just him being young and stupid, that he'd grow out of it." The pieces started falling into place then. Jake's suggestions that I try a new workout routine. His comments about certain outfits being more flattering than others. The way he'd gone quiet when his college friends talked about their girlfriends being models or actresses. His insistence that we take multiple photos every time we went out because we need to get a good one. I'd interpreted all of it as him caring about me, wanting me to look my best, being supportive of my health and appearance. But now, standing in the wreckage of what was supposed to be my wedding day, I could see it for what it really was. A slow, steady campaign to make me feel like I wasn't enough just as I was. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The worst part was that it had worked. Over the 2 years we'd been together, I'd started seeing myself through his eyes. I'd begun to notice flaws I'd never paid attention to before, to feel self-conscious in ways I'd never experienced. I'd started avoiding certain angles in photos, wearing more makeup than I used to, changing my hair color twice to see if he'd like it better. And still, it hadn't been enough. Even after all that adapting and changing and trying to become the woman he wanted me to be, I still wasn't beautiful enough to marry. Standing there in that empty chapel, still wearing my grandmother's dress, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life wondering if I was pretty enough for someone else's standards. I wasn't going to let Jake Harrison's cruelty define how I saw myself. But I also wasn't going to pretend that his words hadn't cut me to the bone. They had. He'd taken my deepest insecurity, the fear that lives in the back of every woman's mind, that she's not attractive enough, and he'd confirmed it in the most public, humiliating way possible. As my family helped me out of the chapel and into my father's car, still wearing my wedding dress because I couldn't bear to take it off yet, I caught a glimpse of myself in the passenger side mirror. My makeup was smudged, my hair was falling, out of its careful arrangement, and my eyes were red from crying. But underneath all of that, I could still see the woman who had felt beautiful that morning. She was still there, buried under the pain and humiliation. But she was there. And I was going to find her again, not for Jake or for anyone else, but for me. I didn't know it then, but that ride home from the chapel was the beginning of everything. That came after. The transformation, the discovery of who I really was. And yes, eventually, the day I would walk into Jake's next wedding and watch his face change when he saw what I'd become. But that's getting ahead of myself. First, I had to survive the aftermath of September 15th and learn how to build a life from the ashes of the one that had just burned down in front of 200 witnesses. The apartment felt like a tomb when I finally made it home that night. Sofia had insisted on staying with me. but I'd sent her away after she helped me out of my grandmother's dress. I needed to be alone with the wreckage, to sit in the silence and try to understand what had just happened to my life. I hung the dress carefully in my closet, smoothing out the wrinkles and making sure the antique lace wasn't damaged. It seemed important to treat it with respect, even though wearing it had led to the most humiliating moment of my life. The dress wasn't to blame for Jake's cruelty. If anything, it had been my armor that day, connecting me to generations of women who had loved and been loved in return. My reflection in the bedroom mirror looked like a stranger. My hair was still partially pinned up from the wedding style, but pieces had fallen loose and hung limply around my face. My makeup was smudged beyond recognition, leaving dark circles under my eyes that had nothing to do with the mascara. I looked exactly like what I was, a woman who had been destroyed in public and was now trying to figure out how to keep breathing. I changed into an old college t-shirt and yoga pants, then sat on my bed surrounded by the remnants of what was supposed to be my wedding day. The boutonniere that was meant for Jake's lapel sat on my nightstand next to my grandmother's vintage camera. The wedding programs Sofia had spent weeks designing were stacked on my dresser, now completely useless. 200 copies of The Wedding of Emma Rodriguez and Jake Harrison, with our names intertwined in elegant script. The worst part was the quiet. My phone had been buzzing nonstop since we left the chapel. Friends and family calling to check on me, but I'd turned it off hours ago. I couldn't face their sympathy, their anger on my behalf, their well-meaning assurances that I was better off without him. Not yet. First, I needed to understand how I'd missed all the signs that led to this moment. I pulled out a notebook and started writing down every memory I could think of where Jake had made comments about my appearance. The list grew longer than I expected, filled with moments I'd forgotten or rationalized away. The time he'd suggested I might want to try a new foundation because the one I was using made me look washed out in photos. His comment about how lucky I was that he didn't care about having a girlfriend who looked like a model. The way he'd go quiet whenever we passed particularly attractive women on the street, then seem almost resentful when he looked back at me. There was the incident 6 months into our relationship when we'd run into his ex-girlfriend Madison at a coffee shop. Downtown, she was everything I wasn't. Tall, blonde, with the kind of effortless beauty that makes other women immediately check their own appearance in nearby mirrors. Jake had introduced me, but I'd caught him staring at her long after she'd walked away. When I'd asked about it later, he'd said, "I just forgot how pretty she was." But don't worry, personality matters more than looks. At the time, I'd taken it as a compliment. He was choosing me for my personality, for who I was inside. Now I could see it for what it really was. A warning that he was settling for me, that he was making a sacrifice every day he stayed with me. The pattern was there if I'd been willing to see it. Jake had never called me beautiful, not once in 2 years. Pretty sometimes, cute often, sweet always, but never beautiful. He'd compliment my clothes or my hair or my makeup, but never me. It was like he was always trying to improve the package rather than appreciating what was inside it. I remembered the night he'd proposed, 8 months earlier on the Zilker Park hiking trail, where we'd had our first serious conversation about the future. I'd been so focused on the romance of the moment, the surprise of it, the relief that he wanted to marry me that I'd overlooked something crucial. His proposal had been about our compatibility, our shared goals, our friendship. He'd talked about building a life together, about being partners, about how much sense we made as a couple. But he'd never said I was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, or that he couldn't imagine living without me, or any of the passionate declarations you hear in movies or read in books. At the time, I'd told myself that was better. That mature love was about more than just physical attraction. That choosing someone for practical reasons was smarter than being swept away by chemistry. But now I wondered if I'd been making excuses for settling, just like he had been. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Jake had never loved me the way I'd loved him. I had been head over heels, completely devoted, ready to build my entire future around our relationship. But for him, I'd been a safe choice, a practical decision, someone who met most of his criteria for a wife except for the one that apparently mattered most. I spent that first night going through photo albums, both physical and digital, looking at 2 years' worth of memories with new eyes. In almost every picture, I was smiling genuinely, radiating happiness at being with him. But Jake's smiles looked different now, polite, performed, like he was playing the role of devoted boyfriend rather than actually feeling it. There was our vacation to Colorado last summer, where I'd felt so happy and free hiking through the mountains with him. But looking at the photos now, I could see how he'd positioned himself in most of them to minimize how much of me was visible. How he'd insisted on retaking shots until we got ones where the lighting was better, which usually meant ones where I looked smaller or was partially hidden behind him. The worst discovery was a series of photos from his company's Christmas party last year. I'd spent weeks picking out the perfect dress, getting my hair done professionally, wanting to look worthy of being on his arm at the fancy hotel ballroom event. I'd felt confident that night, proud to be his girlfriend, excited to meet his colleagues and show them the woman he'd chosen. But scrolling through the photos his coworker had posted on social media, I could see something I'd missed in the moment. Jake's discomfort, the way he'd kept his arm loosely around my waist instead of pulling me close, how he'd introduced me with my name and job title rather than as his girlfriend. The polite distance he'd maintained between us all evening, like he was escorting a friend rather than celebrating with the woman he loved. I'd gone to bed that night thinking the party had been a success, that I'd made a good impression, that Jake's colleagues had liked me. But now I could see that he'd been ashamed of me. Not openly cruel about it, but quietly, consistently diminishing my presence in his life. The sun was coming up by the time I finished my analysis of our relationship, and I felt like an archaeologist who had just uncovered evidence of a civilization I'd never understood. The relationship I thought I'd been living in hadn't existed. Jake had been performing the role of loving boyfriend while privately cataloging all the ways I didn't measure up to his standards. But here's what surprised me. Along with the pain and humiliation, I felt something else. Relief. Not because the wedding was off, that still felt like a devastating loss, but relief that I finally understood what had been happening. All those times I'd felt insecure or inadequate in our relationship, all those moments when I'd wondered if I was overthinking his comments or imagining his lack of enthusiasm, I'd been right. My instincts had been trying to protect me from someone who didn't value me the way I deserved to be valued. I made coffee as the morning light filled my kitchen and sat at my small dining table with my grandmother's camera in my hands. She'd bought it in 1962 for her honeymoon with my grandfather, a man who'd loved her so completely that he'd written her love letters every day for the 40 years they were married. Even after she developed dementia in her final years, he'd sit beside her bed reading those letters aloud, reminding her of how beautiful she was, how much joy she'd brought to his life. That was the kind of love I'd thought I was getting with Jake. The kind where someone sees you clearly and chooses you anyway, not despite your flaws, but including them as part of what makes you uniquely yourself. But Jake had been trying to love me despite my appearance rather than embracing all of who I was. Holding my grandmother's camera, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I was going to learn how to see myself the way my grandfather had seen my grandmother. Not through Jake's critical eyes or society's impossible standards, but through the lens of someone who valued authenticity over perfection. I'd always loved photography, but had put it aside during my relationship with Jake. He'd thought it was a nice hobby, but had suggested I focus on more practical skills that could advance my career in graphic design. Now I realized I'd given up one of the things that brought me the most joy because he hadn't seen value in it. That morning, I took my first photo in over a year. Nothing dramatic or artistic, just the view from my kitchen window. Sunlight streaming through the leaves of the oak tree in my courtyard, casting dancing shadows on the brick wall. But something about capturing that moment, preserving that particular combination of light and shadow, felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd lost. My phone had dozens of missed calls and text messages when I finally turned it back on. Sofia had texted me every hour asking if I was okay. My parents had called multiple times. Even some of my college friends who'd been at the wedding had reached out, offering support and expressing their shock at what Jake had done. But the message that surprised me most was from Chloe Williams, my coworker at Sunset Coffee Roasters. We'd worked together for almost a year but had never socialized outside of our shifts. She was one of those naturally confident people who seemed to know exactly who she was and never apologized for taking up space in the world. Her text was simple. "Emma, I heard what happened yesterday. I know we don't know each other that well, but if you need someone to talk to who won't try to make you feel better with platitudes, I'm here. Sometimes you just need someone to sit with you in the mess." Something about her message cut through. All the well-meaning sympathy I'd been avoiding. She wasn't offering to fix me or telling me everything would be okay. She was just offering to be present while I figured out how to put myself back together. I texted her back. "Are you working today?" Her response came immediately. "Not until this afternoon. Want to meet for coffee somewhere that's not our workplace?" An hour later, I was sitting across from Chloe at Radio Coffee on Barton Springs Road, still wearing my yoga pants and college t-shirt, my hair pulled back in a messy bun. I probably looked like I'd been hit by a truck, but Chloe didn't comment on my appearance. Instead, she ordered us both large coffees and a plate of pastries, then settled back in her chair like she had all the time in the world. "So," she said after I'd told her the whole story, "what are you going to do now?" The question caught me off guard. Everyone else had been focused on what Jake had done to me, how awful he was, how I deserved better. But Chloe was asking about my next move, assuming I had agency in what happened next. "I don't know," I admitted. "I feel like I don't even know who I am anymore. I spent 2 years trying to be the woman Jake wanted me to be, and it turns out that was never going to be enough." Chloe nodded thoughtfully. "That's the thing about trying to be someone else's version of perfect. You can't win because you're playing by rules that were designed to make you fail." "What do you mean?" "Think about it," she said, leaning forward. "If Jake had really wanted to marry you, he would have found you beautiful exactly as you are. The fact that he didn't means the problem was never your appearance. The problem was that he was looking for reasons not to commit, and your looks became his excuse." Her words hit me like a revelation. I'd been so focused on Jake's criticism of my appearance that I'd missed the deeper truth. Someone who loved me wouldn't have been looking for flaws to criticize in the first place. I keep thinking about all the ways I tried to change myself. For him, I said, different makeup, new clothes, working out more. I thought if I could just get it right, he'd see me the way I wanted to be seen. And now, I thought about the photo I'd taken that morning. The way capturing that moment of light and shadow had felt like remembering who I was before Jake's opinions had become more important than my own instincts. Now, I think I want to remember what it feels like to see myself clearly again. Chloe smiled, and it was the first genuine smile I'd seen since the wedding disaster. That sounds like a good place to start. We sat there for another hour, talking about everything and nothing. Chloe told me about her own journey of learning to trust herself, about relationships she'd walked away from when she realized she was changing herself to fit someone else's expectations. She didn't try to minimize what I'd been through or rush me toward feeling better. She just listened and occasionally offered observations that helped me see my situation from new angles. When we finally left the coffee shop, I felt something I hadn't expected. Hope. Not hope that Jake would change his mind or that everything would go back to the way it was. hope that I could build something better from the ruins of what I'd lost. That afternoon, I called my supervisor at the graphic design firm where I worked, part-time, and asked for some time off. Then I drove to the camera store downtown and bought film for my grandmother's vintage camera. The clerk, an older man with kind eyes, showed me how to load it properly and gave me some basic tips for shooting with vintage equipment. "This is a beautiful camera," he said, examining it carefully. "They don't make them like this anymore." "Your grandmother had excellent taste." "She was an excellent woman," I replied, and for the first time since the wedding, saying those words didn't make me want to cry. I spent the rest of that week exploring Austin through my camera lens, rediscovering neighborhoods I'd lived in for years but had never really seen. I photographed the murals on South First Street, the way afternoon light hit the windows of downtown buildings, the expressions on people's faces at the farmers market on Saturday morning. Each photo felt like a small act of rebellion against Jake's version of who I was supposed to be. He'd wanted me to be smaller, quieter, more concerned with fitting in than standing out. But behind my camera, I felt bold and curious and fully present in my own life. On Friday evening, exactly 1 week after the wedding that never happened, I was walking through Zilker Park when I saw them. Jake and Madison, sitting together on a blanket near the Great Lawn, sharing what looked like a picnic dinner. They were far enough away that they didn't see me, but close enough that I could observe them clearly. Madison looked exactly the same as she had in the coffee shop 2 years earlier. Effortlessly beautiful, the kind of woman who probably woke up looking like she'd just stepped out of a magazine. But what struck me wasn't her appearance. It was the way Jake was looking at her, with the kind of attention and admiration he'd never directed toward me, even in our best moments. For a minute, I felt that familiar stab of inadequacy. Here was proof that Jake was capable of that kind of devotion, that kind of obvious attraction. He just hadn't felt it for me. But then I lifted my camera and looked at them through the viewfinder, and something shifted. Through the lens, they looked like strangers. Just two people having a picnic in a park. Nothing more or less significant than that. Jake's opinion of my worthiness suddenly seemed like just one person's perspective, not an objective truth about my value as a human being. I didn't take the photo. Instead, I lowered the camera and walked away, feeling lighter with each step. For the first time since the wedding, I wasn't thinking about Jake at all. I was thinking about the golden hour light filtering through the trees, about the elderly couple I'd seen earlier feeding ducks by the pond, about the dinner I was going to cook for myself when I got home. That night, I developed the photos I'd taken that week in the darkroom I'd set up in my spare bedroom closet years earlier. As each image appeared in the developer solution, I felt like I was watching myself come back to life. These were pictures, taken by someone who was paying attention to the world around her, someone who found beauty in unexpected places, someone who had something unique to offer. Looking at my week's worth of photography, I realized I'd been asking the wrong question. Instead of wondering why Jake didn't find me beautiful enough, I should have been asking why I'd given someone else the power to determine my worth. Instead of trying to change myself to meet his standards, I should have been looking for someone whose standards included valuing the person I actually was. I pinned the best photos to the wall of my bedroom, creating a gallery of the life I was building without Jake's input or approval. Each image reminded me that I had eyes to see beauty, hands to create it, and a perspective that was entirely my own. The woman who had been devastated by Jake's rejection was still there, still healing from the public humiliation of being left at the altar. But she was sharing space now with someone else. The woman I'd been before I'd started shrinking myself to fit into Jake's limited vision of who I should be. And for the first time in longer than I cared to admit, I was curious about who that woman might become. 3 months had passed since the chapel incident, and I was finally starting to feel like myself again. My photography was gaining momentum, with several local businesses commissioning me for their marketing materials. I'd lost 15 pounds without trying. simply because I was walking all over Austin with my camera, instead of sitting in restaurants trying to make conversation with someone who never really wanted to hear what I had to say. My skin was clearer, my energy was higher, and for the first time in years, I actually liked the person staring back at me in the mirror. That's when Jake decided to remind me he still existed. The first sign of trouble came through Sofia, who called me on a Tuesday evening while I was editing photos from a weekend wedding I'd shot for a couple who'd found me through word of mouth. "Emma, you need to know something," Sofia said without preamble. "Jake's been asking people about you." I paused mid-edit, a feeling of unease settling in my stomach. "What kind of asking?" "Mutual friends, people from college. He's been reaching out, saying he's worried about you, that you've been acting erratic since the wedding. He's telling people you've been stalking him and Madison." The accusation was so absurd I almost laughed. I'd seen them exactly once since that day in Zilker Park, and that had been completely by accident when I was photographing the sunset from the pedestrian bridge, and they'd happened to be jogging below. I'd actually packed up my equipment and left to avoid any potential awkwardness. "That's completely untrue," I told Sofia. "I've barely left my apartment except for work and photo shoots." "I know that, and anyone who knows you knows that. But Jake's being very convincing. He's got this whole narrative about how you're not handling the breakup well, how he's concerned for your mental health. The strategy was as brilliant as it was cruel. By positioning himself as the concerned ex-boyfriend worried about my well-being, Jake was accomplishing two things: making himself look like the compassionate good guy, and undermining my credibility if I tried to tell people what had really happened at the chapel. "Why would he do this?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. "Because Madison doesn't know the real reason he left you at the altar," Sofia said grimly. "I did some digging through mutual friends. Jake told her that you two just weren't compatible, that it was a mutual decision to call off the wedding. He's been painting himself as the victim of a crazy ex-girlfriend who can't let go." The realization hit me like a physical blow. Jake wasn't just trying to move on from our relationship. He was actively rewriting history to protect his reputation and his new romance. By making me look unstable, he could explain away any version of events that made him look like the villain. "There's more," Sofia continued. "Remember Marcus Chen from Peak Performance Fitness? The trainer who's been helping you with your hiking, conditioning?" I'd started working with Marcus as part of my new focus on taking care of myself. He was patient and encouraging, never making me feel like I needed to apologize for my fitness level. More importantly, he was teaching me to appreciate what my body could do, rather than just focusing on how it looked. "What about Marcus?" "Jake approached him yesterday, told him he was worried about you, that you'd been obsessing over your appearance since your breakdown at the wedding. He suggested that Marcus might want to be careful about encouraging what he called your unhealthy behavior patterns." My hands started shaking as the implications sank in. Jake wasn't just spreading rumors. He was actively trying to sabotage the new support system I'd built for myself. He wanted to isolate me, to make me look unstable, to ensure that his version of events was the only one people heard. Did Marcus believe him? No, but only because I got to him first. I told him the truth about what happened at the chapel. He was horrified, said Jake's behavior was a classic pattern of emotional abuse followed by reputation destruction. That evening, I called Chloe and told her everything. We met at her apartment in East Austin, a cozy space filled with plants and artwork from local artists. She listened to the whole story while making us dinner, her expression growing darker with each detail. "This is psychological warfare," she said finally, setting down her wine glass with more force than necessary. "He's trying to control the narrative because he knows what he did was indefensible. But why now? It's been 3 months. I thought he'd moved on with Madison." Chloe gave me a look that was both sympathetic and knowing. "Emma, have you seen your social media lately? Really looked at it?" I'd been posting my photography regularly on Instagram, sharing the work I was proudest of, along with little snippets about my rediscovered love for capturing Austin's hidden beauty. The response had been overwhelmingly positive, with followers growing steadily and several potential clients reaching out through direct messages. What about it? You look happy. Actually, genuinely happy for the first time since I've known you. Your photos are getting attention. You're building a business. You're glowing in every picture. You look like someone who's thriving, not someone who was devastated by losing him. The truth of her words settled over me slowly. In my recent photos, I did look different, confident, radiant, like someone who'd found her purpose instead of someone who'd been rejected and broken. He can't stand it, Chloe continued. Jake expected you to fall apart without him. He probably thought you'd spend months pining after him, proving that he was this great catch you couldn't live without. Instead, you're out here building a life. That looks better than anything you had with him. That night, I went through my Instagram posts from the past 3 months with new eyes. Chloe was right. The woman in these photos looked nothing like the insecure, diminished person I'd become during my relationship with Jake. She looked alive, engaged, creative. She looked like someone worth knowing. But Jake's campaign was having an effect. The next few weeks, I noticed changes in how some people interacted with me. A few acquaintances who'd been friendly before seemed distant when I ran into them around town. Someone canceled a photography booking at the last minute with a vague excuse about changing circumstances. Even the barista at my favorite coffee shop, who'd always been chatty and warm, suddenly seemed professional and distant. The worst incident happened at a gallery opening downtown, where I was displaying some of my recent work as part of a group show featuring local photographers. I'd been looking forward to the evening for weeks, excited to see my photos displayed professionally and to network with other artists in the community. I was standing near my piece, a black and white shot of morning light streaming through the windows of an abandoned warehouse, when I overheard a conversation that made my blood run cold. "That's her," a woman was saying to her companion, gesturing discreetly in my direction. "The one I told you about. My friend knows her ex-fiancé. Apparently, she had a complete breakdown at their wedding and has been stalking him and his new girlfriend ever since." "Really?" the other woman replied, looking at me with the kind of morbid curiosity usually reserved for car accidents. "She seems so normal." "That's what makes it scary," the first woman said. "You never know with people like that. Her ex is genuinely worried about what she might do next." I felt my face burning with shame and anger. These women didn't know me, had never spoken to me, but they'd already decided I was dangerous and unstable based entirely on Jake's lies. I wanted to confront them, to tell them the truth about what had really happened, but I knew it would only make me look more unhinged. Instead, I quietly gathered my things and left the gallery, despite the fact that the opening was supposed to celebrate my work. Walking to my car, I felt the familiar weight of humiliation settling over my shoulders, like a heavy coat. But this time, the feeling was accompanied by something else. Rage. Pure, clean anger at Jake's cowardice and cruelty. He wasn't content to have rejected me publicly. Now he was systematically destroying my reputation to protect his own image. That night, I called my father. We'd always been close, but I'd been hesitant to burden him with the details of Jake's campaign against me. Now I needed advice from someone who understood how to fight back against this kind of calculated attack. "Mija," he said after I'd explained the situation, "this isn't about you being crazy or unstable. This is about a weak man trying to cover his tracks after behaving badly. But what can I do? If I defend myself, I look defensive. If I try to tell people what really happened, it becomes my word against his. You document everything," he said firmly. "Every interaction, every lie, every person who repeats his stories. You build a timeline that shows the pattern of his behavior, and then you wait for him to make a mistake, because men like Jake always do." My father's advice turned out to be prescient. Jake's mistake came 2 weeks later, in the form of a phone call that I recorded on Chloe's advice. I was editing photos in my home office when my phone rang. Jake's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment, I considered not answering. We hadn't spoken directly since the chapel, and I couldn't imagine what he wanted to say to me now. But curiosity won out, and I accepted the call after starting the recording app Chloe had helped me install. "Emma?" Jake's voice was smooth and concerned, the tone he'd always used when he was trying to convince me he knew what was best for me. "I've been worried about you." "Worried about what exactly?" "People are telling me you've been having a hard time since our wedding was canceled. I know this has been difficult for you, and I want you to know I don't blame you for struggling to move on." The gaslighting was so blatant it took my breath away. He was positioning himself as the magnanimous ex while simultaneously suggesting I was the one having trouble accepting our breakup. "I'm doing fine, Jake. Better than fine, actually." "I'm glad to hear that, but some of your behavior lately has been concerning. The photography obsession, the dramatic weight loss, posting constantly on social media. It seems like you're trying to reinvent yourself instead of dealing with your feelings about what happened between us." Photography obsession, as if pursuing. My passion was a symptom of mental illness rather than a sign of personal growth. "My photography is my career now. I'm building a business." "Emma, we both know you're not really cut out for that kind of work. You're too sensitive, too emotional. I'm worried you're setting yourself up for disappointment." There it was. The same undermining disguised as concern that had characterized our entire relationship. Jake couldn't stand that I was succeeding without his approval, so he was trying to convince me that my success wasn't real. "What do you want, Jake?" "I want to help you. Madison and I have been talking, and we think it might be good for you to get some professional help. You know, to work through your feelings about the wedding and learn some healthy coping mechanisms." The suggestion that he and Madison had been discussing my mental health was infuriating enough, but the implication that I needed professional help for being left at the altar was beyond insulting. "Let me get this straight," I said, my voice deadly calm. "You're calling to suggest I need therapy because I'm building a successful photography business and getting my life back together after you humiliated me in front of 200 people? Emma, you're getting defensive again. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You can't have a rational conversation about your behavior without getting emotional." The word emotional was wielded like a weapon, designed to make me feel ashamed of having feelings about being treated badly. It was a trap I'd fallen into countless times during our relationship, apologizing for my reactions to his behavior instead of addressing the behavior itself. But I wasn't the same woman who'd accepted his criticism and tried to change herself to earn his approval. 3 months of rediscovering who I was had given me something Jake had spent 2 years trying to take away: confidence in my own perceptions. "You're right, Jake. I am emotional about this. I'm angry that you left me at the altar, and I'm furious that you're now spreading lies about me to justify your own cowardice. I never spread lies about you." "Really? So you didn't tell Marcus Chen that I was having an unhealthy obsession with my appearance? You didn't tell our mutual friends that I was stalking you and Madison? You didn't suggest to anyone that I had a breakdown at our wedding?" The silence on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know. Jake hadn't expected me to know about his campaign, and he certainly hadn't expected me to confront him directly about it. "Emma, I think you're misunderstanding." "I'm not misunderstanding anything. You're trying to destroy my reputation because you can't handle the fact that I'm doing better without you than I ever did with you." "Oh, that's not true." "Isn't it? Look at my Instagram, Jake. Look at the work I'm doing, the life I'm building. I'm happier now than I was during our entire relationship, and you can't stand it." Another long pause. When Jake spoke again, his voice had lost its false concern and taken on the cold edge I remembered from our worst arguments. "You know what, Emma? You're right. You are doing better, and frankly, it's pathetic. All this effort to prove you don't need me, all this desperate Reinvention of yourself. It's obvious you're still obsessed with showing me what I lost. There it was. The truth beneath all his manipulation and concern trolling. Jake couldn't admit that leaving me had been a mistake, so he had to convince himself and everyone else that my success was really just an elaborate performance designed to win him back. I'm not trying to prove anything to you, Jake. I'm living my life. Right. And I'm sure it's just a coincidence that you've suddenly become this fitness enthusiast and professional photographer. You're trying to transform yourself into someone I'd find attractive, but it's too late. I've moved on with someone who was already beautiful. The cruelty in his voice was breathtaking, but it was also clarifying. This was who Jake really was. Someone so threatened by my independence that he had to tear me down to feel secure in his own choices. You're right about one thing, I said quietly. It is too late. But not because you've moved on. It's too late. Because I have, and I've realized that no amount of beauty could make me want to be with someone who would leave their fiancé at the altar and then spend months trying to destroy her reputation to cover their own cowardice. I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking with adrenaline and righteous anger. But for the first time since this whole ordeal began, the shaking wasn't from fear or humiliation. It was from the power of finally standing up to someone who had tried to make me smaller than I was. That recording became the foundation of everything that came next. Chloe helped me create a detailed timeline of Jake's behavior, complete with screenshots of social media posts, saved text messages, and witness statements from people who'd heard his version of events. We weren't planning to use it as legal action, but having documentation made me feel less helpless against his campaign of lies. More importantly, the phone call had shown me something crucial. Jake was afraid. Afraid that my success made him look bad for leaving me. Afraid that people would start questioning his version of events. Afraid that the woman he'd dismissed as not beautiful enough was building a life that looked more attractive than anything he had to offer. That fear, I realized, was something I could work with. Because the best revenge against someone who expected you to fail wasn't just succeeding. It was succeeding so spectacularly that their attempts to diminish you only made their own inadequacy more obvious. And I was just getting started. 6 months after that devastating phone call with Jake, my life had transformed in ways I never could have imagined. My photography business was thriving, with bookings scheduled 3 months in advance. I'd lost 30 pounds through hiking and strength training with Marcus, not because I was trying to become someone else's version of beautiful, but because I'd discovered the joy of feeling strong and capable in my own body. Most importantly, I'd learned to trust my own voice again. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in August, slipped under my apartment door like a snake in the grass. Cream-colored cardstock with elegant gold lettering announced the upcoming nuptials of Jake Harrison and Madison Pierce. September 15th. The exact same date as our failed wedding, exactly 1 year later. The audacity took my breath away. Not only was Jake remarrying on the anniversary of publicly humiliating me, but someone had made sure I received an invitation. There was no return address, no personal note, just the cold formality of embossed text announcing their celebration at the Grand Ballroom of Hotel Zaza, Austin's most exclusive wedding venue. Chloe found me staring at the invitation when she arrived for our weekly coffee date, her arms full of groceries for the dinner we'd planned to cook together. "That son of a bitch," she said, reading over my shoulder. "He's doing this on purpose." Of course he is. He wants to erase what happened exactly a year ago by having the perfect wedding on the same date. It's like he's trying to overwrite history. Are you going to go? The question hung in the air between us. 6 months ago, the idea would have been unthinkable. But the woman I'd become wasn't the same person who'd been left standing at an altar in her grandmother's dress. That woman had been broken by Jake's rejection. This woman had been forged by it. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Part of me wants to show him how little power he has over me anymore." but another part thinks the healthiest thing would be to ignore it completely. Chloe sat down across from me, her expression thoughtful. What would feel like closure for you? Not revenge, not proving a point, but actual closure? I considered her question carefully. For months, I'd been building a life that had nothing to do with Jake's opinion of me. My self-worth was no longer tied to his validation or lack thereof. But there was still a part of me that wondered what would happen if he saw who I'd become. Not because I wanted him back, but because I wanted him to understand the magnitude of what he'd thrown away. I think, I said slowly, I want him to see that his worst fear came true. That leaving me was the biggest mistake of his life. Not because I became the woman he wanted me to be, but because I became someone so much better than he ever deserved. That evening, I called Marcus and asked him to meet me at Peak Performance. Fitness. We'd been working together for months, but tonight I had a different kind of training in mind. I need to ask you something, I said as we settled into his office. And I need you to be completely honest with me. Marcus nodded, his expression serious. We'd developed a friendship built on mutual respect and brutal honesty about what it took to achieve real transformation. If you saw me walking into a room full of people who hadn't seen me in a year, what would their reaction be? Marcus studied my face carefully. Emma, you know you've changed dramatically, but I don't think you realize how dramatically. You're not just in the best shape of your life physically. You carry yourself completely differently. You move like someone who owns her space instead of apologizing for taking it up. But honestly, do you think I'm beautiful now? The question had been lurking in the back of my mind for months, not because I needed Marcus's validation, but because I wanted an objective opinion from someone who'd known me before and after my transformation. That's the wrong question, Marcus said gently. You were always beautiful, Emma. What's changed is that you finally believe it. And that belief, that confidence, that's what makes people stop and stare when you walk into a room now. That night, I stood in front of my full-length mirror and really looked at myself for the first time in months. My body was lean and strong from months of hiking and weight training. My skin glowed with the health that came from spending time outdoors and eating well because I was taking care of myself rather than stress eating or starving myself for someone else's approval. But more than the physical changes, there was something different in my eyes, a clarity and strength that hadn't been there before. The woman looking back at me was someone Jake had never met. She was confident without being defensive, strong, without being hard, beautiful without needing anyone else to confirm it. She was someone who had survived public humiliation and emerged not just intact, but improved. The next morning, I made 2 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to Elena Vasquez, a boutique designer whose work I'd been following on social media. Her dresses were architectural masterpieces designed for women who wanted to look powerful rather than pretty. I'd been admiring her work for months, but had never had an occasion special enough to justify the investment. I need something extraordinary, I told Elena when she answered the phone. Something that makes a statement without saying a word. Elena's studio was in a converted warehouse in East Austin, filled with mannequins draped in fabric that looked like liquid metal and flowing water. She listened carefully as I explained what I needed, never asking directly about the occasion, but clearly understanding that this dress needed to be armor as much as fashion. I have something in mind, she said, leading me to a sketch pinned to her design wall. I've been waiting for the right woman to wear it. The design took my breath away. It was a floor-length gown in deep midnight blue, almost black, with a fitted bodice that would showcase the strength I'd built in my shoulders and arms. The neckline was elegant without being revealing, the silhouette was modern without being trendy, and the overall effect was of someone who commanded attention without demanding it. It's perfect, I breathed. The fabric has a subtle shimmer that catches the light when you move, Elena explained. You'll look like you're wearing the night sky." The second phone call was to David Chen, one of Austin's most sought-after hair and makeup artists. I'd photographed his work for several editorial shoots and had been blown away by his ability to enhance someone's natural beauty without hiding it under layers of artifice. "I need to look like the best version of myself," I told him. "Not like someone trying to be someone else." David understood immediately. "Transformation, not costume. I can work with that." The 3 weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of fittings and planning. Elena crafted the dress to fit my body like it had been designed specifically for me, taking in the waist to showcase the curves I'd always had but had never learned to appreciate, and adjusting the length so it would flow perfectly when I walked. David and I experimented with makeup looks that enhanced the definition in my face without hiding the character that life had given me. But the most important preparation wasn't physical, it was mental. I spent hours with my therapist, Dr. Sarah Martinez, working through my motivations for attending the wedding and making sure I was going for the right reasons. "What do you hope to accomplish by being there?" she asked during one of our sessions. "I want to close a chapter," I said. "Not by confronting Jake or causing a scene, but by proving to myself that he no longer has any power over my sense of self-worth. And if seeing him with Madison brings up unexpected emotions, then I'll feel them and leave. But I don't think it will." Jake stopped being someone I wanted to be with the moment he showed me who he really was. Going to this wedding isn't about wanting him back. It's about showing myself how far I've come. The night before the wedding, Chloe came over to help me prepare. We ordered Thai food and sat on my living room floor, painting our nails and talking about everything except the next day's events. "You know," Chloe said as she applied a coat of deep red polish to my fingernails, "I've never seen you look more like yourself than you do right now." "What do you mean?" "When I first met you, you seemed like you were constantly trying to shrink yourself, to take up less space, to be less than you naturally were. Even after Jake left you at the altar, there was still this part of you that was apologizing for existing. But that's gone now. You're not trying to be smaller or bigger or different. You're just completely, unapologetically yourself." Her words settled over me like a warm blanket. She was right. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't performing a version of myself that I thought other people wanted to see. I was simply being who I was and trusting that it was enough. The morning of September 15th dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect Austin day that makes you remember why you fell in love with this city. I woke up without an alarm, feeling rested and calm. No nervous energy, no second-guessing my decision to attend the wedding. Just a quiet confidence that today would be significant and that I was ready for whatever it brought. David arrived at my apartment at noon to begin the transformation process. He worked methodically, first perfecting my skin with a foundation that looked like I wasn't wearing makeup at all, just naturally flawless. Then he defined my eyes with subtle smoky shadows that made my dark brown irises look almost golden in certain light. My lips got a classic red that matched my nail polish, and my hair was styled in loose waves that looked effortless but would photograph beautifully. When Elena arrived with the dress, I felt like I was putting on more than just fabric. The midnight blue gown fit like it had been sewn directly onto my body, skimming my curves in all the right places and flowing like liquid when I moved. The subtle shimmer in the fabric caught the afternoon light streaming through my bedroom windows, creating an almost ethereal effect. "You look," Elena said, stepping back to admire her work, "like a force of nature." The final touch was my grandmother's vintage camera, which I hung around my neck on a thin gold chain. It seemed fitting to have her with me today, a reminder of what real love looked like and what I deserved to find someday. Chloe drove me to Hotel Zaza, both of us quiet during the 15-minute ride downtown. The hotel was one of Austin's most luxurious properties, the kind of place that screamed expensive taste and careful curation. Valet attendants in crisp uniforms directed wedding guests toward the ballroom entrance, where a string quartet played soft classical music. I took a deep breath as we approached the entrance, feeling the weight of my grandmother's camera against my chest and the strength of Elena's dress around my body. This was it. The moment I'd been unconsciously preparing for since the day Jake walked away from our altar. "You ready?" Chloe asked, squeezing my hand. "I'm ready." The grand ballroom was exactly what I'd expected. Elegant, expensive, and designed to photograph beautifully. White flowers cascaded from every surface. Crystal chandeliers cast romantic light over round tables draped in ivory linens, and a live band played softly in one corner. It was the kind of wedding that would generate hundreds of Instagram posts and be featured in local magazines. But as I stepped into the room, I realized something surprising. None of it impressed me. The over-the-top elegance felt hollow, performative, like a stage set, designed to convince people they were witnessing something special rather than something that actually was special. Heads turned as I made my way through the crowd, and I caught fragments of conversations that stopped mid-sentence when people recognized me. I could feel the whispers following in my wake, but for the first time in my life, I didn't care what other people were saying about me. I was here for myself, not for their approval or disapproval. I found a spot near the back of the ceremony, seating, close enough to see everything but far enough away to avoid unwanted conversations. The processional music began, and Jake's groomsmen filed down the aisle, looking uncomfortably formal in their matching tuxedos. Then Jake appeared at the altar, and I felt absolutely nothing. No pain, no longing, no regret. He looked exactly like what he was. A man who had chosen safety and convention over depth and authenticity. Handsome in a generic way, successful in a predictable way, utterly forgettable despite his obvious belief that he was the prize everyone should want. The bridesmaids followed, each one looking like they'd stepped out of a bridal magazine in their matching dusty rose gowns. And then came Madison, resplendent in a ball gown that probably cost more than my car. Her blonde hair arranged in an elaborate updo that had likely taken hours to perfect. She was beautiful, there was no denying that. The kind of traditional beauty that looked good in photographs and never had a hair out of place. But as I watched her walk down the aisle toward Jake, I realized something that surprised me. I didn't envy her. Not her beauty, not her dress, not her moment in the spotlight, because I could see what she couldn't see yet. Jake's pattern of treating women like accessories rather than partners. Madison had no idea that she was marrying someone who would spend their relationship trying to improve her instead of appreciating her. Someone who would offer conditional love based on her ability to meet his impossible standards. Someone who would leave her too, eventually, when she failed to live up to whatever fantasy he'd constructed in his mind. The ceremony proceeded exactly as these ceremonies always do, with traditional vows about loving and honoring each other that sounded beautiful but meant nothing, coming from someone who'd proven he didn't understand what those words actually required. It wasn't until the pastor pronounced them husband and wife that Jake's eyes found mine across the crowded ballroom. The recognition was instantaneous, and I watched his face cycle through a series of emotions: shock, confusion, and then something that looked almost like fear. He was seeing me clearly for the first time, and I could tell he was struggling to reconcile the woman standing confidently in the back of his wedding with the insecure, apologetic person he'd left at an altar a year ago. This wasn't the broken, desperate ex-girlfriend he'd been describing to people for months. This was someone who had taken his worst moment and used it as raw material for building something better. I smiled at him then, not with malice or triumph, but with the kind of peaceful confidence that comes from knowing you've outgrown someone completely. Then I turned and walked out of the ballroom without looking back, leaving Jake to explain to his new bride why his ex-fiancé had just upstaged their wedding simply by existing. The real victory wasn't that I'd shown up and looked beautiful. It was that I'd shown up as myself, completely and unapologetically, and discovered that the opinion of someone who'd never truly seen me didn't matter anymore. Walking through the hotel lobby toward the exit, I felt lighter than I had in years. The chapter was finally closed, not with drama or confrontation, but with the quiet dignity that comes from choosing yourself over someone else's limited vision of who you should be. I had become exactly what Jake feared most, a woman who was better off without him and who would never again mistake his limitations for truth. The weeks following Jake's wedding brought changes I never could have anticipated. The confidence I'd felt walking out of that ballroom had settled into something deeper and more permanent. It wasn't the temporary high of a successful moment. It was the steady foundation of someone who finally understood her own worth. The first indication that my appearance at the wedding had made waves came through my photography business. Within days of the event, my bookings doubled. Apparently, word had spread through Austin's social circles about the woman who'd shown up at her ex's wedding looking absolutely radiant, and suddenly, everyone wanted to work with the photographer, who embodied that kind of transformation. But the call that changed everything came on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after the wedding. I was editing photos from a corporate headshot session when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Emma Rodriguez? This is Jennifer Walsh from Texas Monthly Magazine. I'd love to speak with you about a feature we're considering. Texas Monthly was the state's premier lifestyle publication, known for in-depth profiles of fascinating Texans who embodied resilience and reinvention. The idea that they might want to feature me seemed surreal. What kind of feature? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. We're working on a story about personal transformation and the power of reclaiming your narrative after public humiliation. Your name came up several times when we were researching subjects, and after seeing your photography work and hearing about your recent public appearance, we think you'd be perfect for what we have in mind. I nearly dropped the phone. How did you hear about any of this? Jennifer laughed warmly. Austin's a smaller town than people think, especially in certain social circles. The story of what happened at your wedding last year and your appearance at your ex's recent wedding has been making rounds. But what really caught our attention was your professional work. Your photography portfolio shows incredible artistic growth over the past year, and several local business owners have mentioned working with someone who embodied the kind of confidence they wanted to project in their own branding. The interview took place the following week at a coffee shop in South Austin, far from the downtown scene where I might run into people from my past life. Jennifer was a seasoned journalist with kind eyes and an ability to make people feel comfortable, sharing their stories. She asked thoughtful questions about my journey, never sensationalizing the pain, but focusing instead on the choices I'd made to rebuild myself. What would you say to other women who've experienced public rejection or humiliation? She asked toward the end of our conversation. I thought carefully before answering. I'd say that the worst thing that can happen to you might also be the best thing, if you're willing to use it as a starting point instead of an ending point. Jake leaving me at that altar was devastating, but it also freed me from trying to be someone I'm not. I spent 2 years trying to earn love from someone who was fundamentally incapable of seeing my value. When that ended, I finally had the space to see it myself. And now? Now I know that the right person won't need me to change everything about myself to be worthy of love. They'll see what Jake couldn't see, that I was always enough, exactly as I was. The article came out 6 weeks later with a cover photo that took my breath away. Jennifer had arranged for me to be photographed by one of Austin's most celebrated portrait artists, and the resulting image showed me holding my grandmother's vintage camera, wearing one of Elena's designs, looking directly at the viewer with an expression of quiet strength and absolute self-possession. The headline read, "The Art of Rising: How One Woman Transformed Public Humiliation into Personal Power." The article was beautiful, focusing not on the drama of what Jake had done, but on the deliberate work I'd put into rebuilding my sense of self. It talked about my photography business, my fitness journey with Marcus, and the support system I'd built with friends like Chloe who saw my potential even when I couldn't see it myself. But more than anything, it captured something I'd been trying to articulate for months. That true transformation isn't about becoming someone new, it's about becoming more fully yourself than you've ever been before. The response was immediate and overwhelming. My phone rang constantly with interview requests from podcasts and local television shows. Photography clients booked sessions months in advance. Most surprisingly, I started receiving messages from women all over Texas and beyond who had read the article and wanted to share their own stories of transformation after heartbreak. One message particularly moved me. It came from a woman named Caroline in Houston, who had been left by her fiancé 2 weeks before their wedding, after he decided he wanted to explore other options before settling down. "I've been wallowing for 8 months," she wrote. "Reading your story made me realize I've been waiting for him to come back and validate that leaving me was a mistake, instead of building a life that proves I'm better off without someone who could treat me that way. Thank you for showing me what's possible when you stop trying to earn love from someone who doesn't deserve you." Messages like Caroline's made me realize that my story had become bigger than just my personal journey. It had become a roadmap for other women who needed to see that public humiliation didn't have to be the end of their story. The momentum continued building throughout the winter. I was invited to speak at women's conferences and business networking events. A local gallery offered me a solo exhibition of my photography work. Most unexpectedly, I was approached by a literary agent who thought my story would make a compelling memoir. But the moment that felt like the true completion of my transformation came on a cold February morning when I was having breakfast at my favorite cafe on South First Street. I was editing photos on my laptop, completely absorbed in my work, when a shadow fell across my table. "Emma?" I looked up to find Madison Pierce, though she was Madison Harrison now, standing beside my table with a coffee cup clutched in her hands. She looked exactly as beautiful as she had on her wedding day, but there was something different in her expression. A tightness around her eyes, a tension in her smile that I recognized all too well. "Madison," I said calmly, closing my laptop. "How are you?" She gestured to the empty chair across from me. "Could I sit for a moment?" I nodded, curious about what she could possibly want to discuss with me. Madison settled into the chair and wrapped her hands around her coffee cup like she was trying to warm herself. "I wanted to apologize," she said without preamble, "for the things Jake told me about you, and for believing them without question." "What things?" "He said you were unstable, that you'd been stalking us, that you couldn't accept that your relationship was over. He made you sound desperate and a little dangerous." She paused, looking down at her coffee. "But then I saw you at our wedding, and nothing about you matched what he'd described. You looked confident and beautiful and completely at peace. Like someone who had moved on completely, not someone who was still hung up on him." I felt a familiar anger rise in my chest, but it was tempered by something else. Pity for the woman sitting across from me who was just beginning to see the man she'd married clearly. "Jake has a pattern of rewriting history to make himself look better," I said carefully. "He did the same thing during our relationship, making me feel like my reactions to his behavior were the problem rather than the behavior itself." Madison's face crumpled slightly. "He does that to me too. When I bring up something that bothers me, he makes me feel like I'm being too sensitive or unreasonable, like I'm the problem for having feelings about the way he treats me." There it was. The same erosion of self-trust that I'd experienced, the same gradual conditioning to doubt her own perceptions and reactions. Madison was living the life I would have had if Jake hadn't left me at the altar, and she was already discovering that it wasn't the fairy tale she'd imagined. "Madison," I said gently, "why are you telling me this?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the morning traffic on South First. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I'm starting to think he made a mistake leaving you. and I'm the rebound he convinced himself was an upgrade. The admission hung between us like a confession. Madison wasn't just apologizing for believing Jake's lies about me. She was recognizing that she'd married someone who saw women as interchangeable objects rather than unique individuals worthy of love and respect. The worst part, she continued, is that I can see what he saw in you. You're talented and intelligent, and genuinely kind. When I researched you after the wedding, I found your photography work, read that article in Texas Monthly. You've built something real, something meaningful. I'm just a pretty face with an Instagram following, and I think he's starting to realize that's not enough to build a marriage on. I felt a wave of compassion for this woman who was discovering what I'd learned the hard way. That Jake's love was conditional and shallow, based on external qualities rather than genuine connection. Madison, you're more than what Jake sees. In you. The fact that you're here, having this conversation, shows strength and self-awareness. Don't let him convince you that your worth is tied to your appearance or your social media presence. How did you get past it? She asked. The feeling that you weren't enough for him? I realized that the problem was never that I wasn't enough for Jake. The problem was that Jake wasn't enough for me. He was someone who could only love conditionally, who saw relationships as transactions rather than partnerships. Once I understood that, I stopped trying to earn something that was never available in the first place. Madison nodded slowly, tears forming in her eyes. I think I married someone who's incapable of the kind of love I thought I was getting. What are you going to do about it? I don't know yet. We've only been married 5 months. Everyone expects us to be in the honeymoon phase, but it feels more like I'm auditioning for a role I'll never be right for. She wiped her eyes with a napkin. Can I ask you something? Of course. Do you ever regret that he left you? I mean, if he had gone through with the wedding, you'd be married to him right now instead of me. The question didn't hurt the way it might have a year ago. Instead, it made me smile with genuine warmth. Madison, Jake leaving me at that altar was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to build a life based on my own values and dreams instead of trying to fit into someone else's narrow vision of who I should be. If he'd married me, I'd be living your life right now, trying to be perfect for someone who's always looking for flaws, shrinking myself to avoid conflict, losing pieces of who I am to keep someone happy who's fundamentally unhappy with himself. You make it sound like you're grateful to him. I am grateful, not to him but for the experience. It taught me what I actually want in a partner. Someone who sees my strength instead of trying to diminish it. Someone who encourages my ambitions instead of suggesting I'm not capable of achieving them. Someone who thinks I'm beautiful because of who I am, not despite it. Madison was quiet for a long time, processing what I'd said. Finally, she spoke again. There's something else I need to tell you. Jake still talks about you, a lot. He follows your social media accounts, shows me your photography work, comments on how much you've changed. I think he regrets leaving you, but he's too proud to admit it. The revelation didn't surprise me as much as it might have once. Of course, Jake was watching my success and transformation. It contradicted the narrative he'd constructed about my inadequacy, and people like Jake couldn't stand being proven wrong about their own judgment. That's not my problem anymore, I said, simply. Jake had his chance to see my worth, and he chose not to. I'm not interested in being with someone who only recognizes my value in hindsight, after someone else has done the work of helping me see it myself. We talked for another hour, and by the time Madison left, I could see something different. In her expression. Not quite hope, but the beginning of clarity about her situation. I gave her my business card and told her to call me if she ever wanted to talk more. Thank you, she said as she gathered her things. For not being vindictive or cruel about this. You could have easily told me I got what I deserved for marrying him so quickly after your wedding. Everyone deserves to be loved authentically, I replied. even if it means making difficult decisions about relationships that look perfect from the outside. After Madison left, I sat in the cafe for another hour, reflecting on how surreal the conversation had been. A year and a half ago, Madison Pierce had represented everything I thought I lacked: effortless beauty, social confidence, the kind of polished perfection that made men like Jake fall at her feet. Now I could see her clearly as just another woman, trying to navigate a relationship with someone who was incapable of genuine intimacy. The woman I'd become would never again waste time envying someone else's seemingly perfect life. I'd learned that most perfection was performance, and that authentic happiness was worth more than any carefully curated image. That afternoon, I had lunch with Chloe at our favorite taco truck, and I told her about the encounter with Madison. "She's going to leave him," Chloe said confidently after I'd related the entire conversation. "Maybe not today or tomorrow, but soon. You planted seeds that are going to grow into questions she can't ignore." "I hope so. She deserves better than what she's getting." "So did you, but it took Jake leaving you at the altar for you to see it. Madison's getting to learn the lesson with less public humiliation." We spent the rest of lunch talking about my upcoming gallery exhibition and Chloe's new promotion at work. Our friendship had deepened over the months of my transformation, built on mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than the desperate need for validation that had characterized most of my relationships during the Jake years. That evening, I was editing photos in my home office when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Emma, this is Jake. Could we talk?" I stared at the message for a long time, feeling absolutely nothing. No curiosity about what he wanted to say, no old feelings resurging, no desire for closure or explanation. The man who had once held so much power over my sense of self-worth had become irrelevant to my life. I deleted the message without responding. 2 days later, another text. "I know you're getting my messages. Please call me. There are things I need to say to you." Again, I deleted it without responding. A week after that. "Emma, I made a mistake. I see that now. Can we at least talk about it?" This time, I showed the message to Chloe, who laughed out loud. "He's really doing this, isn't he?" The classic move of realizing what he lost after it's too late. Apparently, but honestly, I feel nothing about it. It's like getting a message from a stranger. That's because you've emotionally moved on completely. Jake is still stuck in the story where you're the woman he rejected, but you're not that person anymore. You're someone he never had the privilege of knowing. Chloe was right. The woman Jake was trying to reach no longer existed. She'd been transformed by his cruelty into someone stronger, more confident, and infinitely more valuable than the person who had once begged for his approval. The messages continued sporadically over the following weeks, becoming more desperate and less coherent. Jake claimed he'd realized I was the love of his life, that he'd made the biggest mistake of his life leaving me, that Madison was beautiful but lacked my depth and intelligence. He promised he would leave his new wife if I would just give him another chance to prove his love. I never responded to any of them. The final message came 3 months later. "I see you're not going to respond, but I need you to know that not a day goes by that I don't regret what I did to you. You were always beautiful, and I was an idiot for not seeing it. I hope someday you can forgive me." I read this one aloud to Marcus during our workout session, and he shook his head in disgust. "He still doesn't get it," Marcus said. "He's apologizing for not recognizing your beauty, like that was the problem. The problem was never your appearance. The problem was his character." Marcus had articulated something I'd been feeling but hadn't quite put into words. Jake's apology was still fundamentally superficial, focused on my looks rather than acknowledging the deeper cruelty of how he'd treated me as a person. He was sorry for being wrong about my attractiveness, but there was no recognition of the emotional abuse, the systematic undermining of my confidence, or the campaign of lies he'd spread after our breakup. That night, I finally responded to Jake's messages, but not with a text. Instead, I posted a photo on Instagram that I'd been saving for the right moment. It was a self-portrait I'd taken with my grandmother's vintage camera, showing me in my photography studio surrounded by my work, wearing one of Elena's designs, laughing at something outside the frame. I looked radiant, successful, and completely content with my life. The caption read, "1 year ago, I thought being left at the altar was the worst thing that could happen to me. Today, I know it was the best thing that could happen to me." Sometimes, what feels like rejection is actually redirection toward the life you were always meant to live. Grateful for every twist in the path that led me here. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Hundreds of comments from women sharing their own stories of transformation after heartbreak, from clients praising my work, from friends celebrating my journey. But the comments that meant the most came from people I'd never met who said my story had inspired them to leave relationships where they weren't valued, to pursue dreams they'd put aside, to stop apologizing for taking up space in the world. Jake never messaged me again after that post. I heard through mutual friends that he and Madison had separated quietly a few months later, with Madison moving back to Dallas to start over. I hoped she was building the kind of life she deserved, one based on her own values rather than someone else's expectations. As for me, I continued building the life I'd discovered in the ashes of my old one. My photography business expanded beyond Austin, with clients seeking me out specifically because they wanted to work with someone who understood transformation from the inside out. I bought a small house in South Austin with a yard where I could have a garden and a studio where I could teach photography workshops to other women looking to rediscover their creative voices. Most importantly, I learned to trust my own judgment about people and relationships. When I started dating again, it was with men who saw my strength as attractive rather than threatening, who encouraged my ambitions rather than suggesting I lower my expectations, who thought I was beautiful not because I fit some narrow standard, but because of the light that came from living authentically. The woman who had stood at an altar in her grandmother's dress, devastated by cruel words about her appearance, felt like a character from someone else's story. I honored her pain and her struggle, but I didn't live in her limitations anymore. Standing in my photography studio on a sunny March afternoon, editing photos from a recent wedding where I'd captured two people who clearly adored each other exactly as they were, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me here. Not gratitude for Jake's cruelty, but gratitude for my own resilience, for the friends who had supported my transformation, and for the discovery that the love I'd been seeking from someone else had been inside me all along, waiting for the right moment to bloom. The altar where Jake had rejected me had become the altar where I'd finally learned to choose myself, and that choice had made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.